It's time for another Fox folktale reading. It, and as I understand it, a copy of the book together form a birthday present for Will. Hope you enjoy, Will. And your friend Sarah Jane says, until you get rich and start your own Fox sanctuary, enjoy this. This one comes from the indigenous people from the northeastern Indian state of Meghalaya. They are the Khasi. Their society, their native society, is interesting because it is matrilineal, so it's the mother who determines the family line, etc. When a man marries a woman, he moves into his mother-in-law's house, and they stay there, the couple, until they have their first child, and then can move out. The Khasi live in a ridiculously gorgeous area, as you're going to see once I get going with the nature photography, and let's go ahead and start. How the Fox Got His White Breast. Once a fox, whose name was Yumur Singh, lived in a cave near the residence of a chief. This fox was a very shameless marauder, and had the impudence to conduct his raids right into the chief's private barnyard, and to devour the best of his flocks, causing him much annoyance and loss. The chief gave his servants orders to catch the fox, but though they laid many traps and snares in his way, he was so wily and so full of cunning that he managed to evade every pitfall, and to continue his raids on the chief's flocks. One of the servants, more ingenious than his fellows, suggested that they should bring out the iron cage in which the chief was wont to lock up state criminals, and to try to wheedle the fox into entering it. So they brought out the iron cage and set it open near the entrance to the barnyard, with a man on guard to watch. By and by, the fox came walking by very cautiously, sniffing the air guardedly, to try and discover if any hidden dangers lay in his path. He soon reached the cage, but it aroused no suspicion in him, for it was so large and so unlike every trap he was familiar with that he entered it without a thought of peril, and ere he was aware of his error, the man on guard had bolted the door behind him and made him a prisoner. There was great jubilation in the chief's household when the capture of the fox was made known. The chief himself was so pleased that he commanded his servants to prepare a feast on the following day as a reward for their vigilance and ingenuity. He also gave orders not to kill the fox till the next day, and that he should be brought out of the cage after the feast and executed in a public place as a warning to other thieves and robbers. So the fox was left to pine in his prison for that night. The fox was very unhappy, as all people in confinement must be. He explored the cage from end to end, but found no passage of egress. He thought out many plans of escape, but not one of them could be put into execution, and he was driven to face the doom of certain death. He whined in his misery and despair, and roamed about the cage all night. Sometime towards morning he was disturbed by the sound of footsteps outside his cage, and, thinking that the chief's men had come to kill him, he lay very still, hardly venturing to breathe. To his relief, the newcomer turned out to be a belated traveler, who, upon seeing a cage, sat down, leaning his weary body against the bars, while the fox kept very still, not wishing to disclose his presence until he found out something more about his unexpected companion, and hoping also to turn his coming to some good account. The traveler was an outlaw driven away from a neighboring state for some offense, and was in great perplexity how to procure the permission of the chief, into whose estate he had now wandered, to dwell there and be allowed to cultivate the land. Thinking that he was quite alone, he began to talk to himself, not knowing that a wily fox was listening attentively to all that he was saying. "I am a most unfortunate individual," said the stranger. "I have been driven away from my home and people. I have no money and no friends, and no belongings except this little polished mirror, which no one is likely to buy. I am so exhausted that if they drive me out of this state, I shall die of starvation on the roadside. If I could only find a friend who could help me to win the favor of the chief, so that I may be permitted to live here unmolested for a time, till my trouble blows over." The fox's heart was beating very fast with renewed hope when he heard these words, and he tried to think of some way to delude the stranger to imagine that he was someone who had influence with the chief, and to get the man to open the cage and let him out. So with all the cunning he was capable of, he accosted the man in his most affable and courteous manner. "Friend and brother," he said, "do not despair. I think I can put you in the way, not only to win the chief's favor, but to become a member of his family." The outlaw was greatly embarrassed when he discovered that someone had overheard him talking. It was such a dark night that he could not see the fox, but thought that it was a fellow man who had accosted him. Fearing to commit himself further if he talked about himself, he tried to divert the conversation away from himself, and asked his companion who he was and what he was doing alone in the cage at night. The fox, nothing loath to monopolize the conversation, gave a most plausible account of his misfortunes, and his tale seemed so sincere and apparently true that it convinced the man on the instant. There is great trouble in this state. The only daughter of the chief is sick, and according to the divinations, she is likely to die unless she can be wedded before sunset tomorrow, and her bridegroom must be a native of some other state. The time was too short to send envoys to any of the neighboring states to arrange for the marriage, and as I happened to pass this way on a journey, the chief's men forcibly detained me on finding that I was a foreigner, and tomorrow they will compel me to marry the chief's daughter, which is much against my will. If you open the door of this cage and let me out, you may become the chief's son-in-law by taking my place in the cage." "What manner of man are you," asked the outlaw, "that you should disdain the honor of marrying the daughter of a chief?" "You are mistaken to think that I disdain the honor," said the fox. "If I had been single, I should have rejoiced in the privilege, but I am married already, and have a wife and family in my own village far from here, and my desire is to be released so that I may return to them." "In that case," replied the man, "I think you are right to refuse. But as for me, it would be a most desirable union, and I should only be too glad to exchange places with you." Thereupon he opened the door of the cage and went in, while the fox slipped out and bolted the door behind him. The man was so pleased with his seeming good fortune that at parting he took off his polished mirror, which was suspended round his neck by a silver chain, and begged his companion to accept it in remembrance of their short but strange encounter. As he was handing it over, his hand came into contact with the fox's thick fur, and he realized then that he had been duped, and had, owing to his innocence, released the most thieving rogue in the forest. Regrets were vain. He was firmly imprisoned within the cage, while he heard the laughter of the fox echoing in the distance as he hurried away to safety, taking the polished mirror with him. The fox was well aware that it was unsafe for him to remain any longer in that locality, so, after fastening the mirror firmly around his neck, he hastened away with all speed, and did not halt till he came to a remote and secluded part of the jungle, where he stopped to take his breath and to rest. Unknown to the fox, a big tiger was lying in wait for prey in that part of the jungle, and upon seeing the fox, made ready to spring upon him. But the fox, hearing some noise, turned around suddenly, and by that movement the polished mirror came right in front of the tiger's face. The tiger saw in it the reflection of his own big jaws and flaming eyes, from which he slunk away in terror, thinking it was some great tiger demon haunting the jungle in the shape of a fox, and from that time the tiger has never been known to attack the fox. One day, when hotly pursued by hunters, the fox plunged into a deep river. As he swam across, the flood carried away his polished mirror, but the stamp of it remains to this day on his breast, in the form of a patch of white fur. The end. Well, as discussed, this video was made especially for Will, and thanks to his friend Sarah Jane. I hope you both enjoyed it. Thank you.